what I'll talk about, actually, I think hopefully will complement the first presentation. There's a lot more information there about intentions, politically, about contact and stuff like that. We're dealing with demography, we're dealing with population numbers, and we're dealing with general patterns. So in some ways it's a sort of context, it's a framework. It's actually joint work, so there's Steffi in the front there who's been working with me on this project, but I'm afraid you've just got me who'll talk about it. So I'll just run through the slides and we'll probably both answer questions at the end. So, I'll try and move forward. Yes. Oh, that's good. So, I'll just talk a little bit about background. And I think the background's fairly apparent. And I suppose the sort of point to make, actually, is that these seminars are about policy. Now, there are very few policies which are explicitly about religion and identity. I suppose the broad area of community relations sort of covers this. But actually, this is sort of like the elephant in the room almost. It's a sort of thing, the basic demography and population numbers, that underpins politics, that actually underpins policy in general. So it's sort of like, this is general information rather than something which is relevant to any one particular policy. So I'll just talk a little bit about that. I'll introduce to you the data that we're using. So we're using population level data from the census and from other sources. And it's actually sort of a different type of data. So I'll talk you through that briefly. And really the substance of the talk, it's got three sorts of bits really. First of all, I talk about religion and demographic accounts. So I'm trying to look at changes in the proportions of Catholics and Protestants and others and people who are nons and not stateds between 2001 and 2011, and trying to break it down into what's due to transfers between different denominations, what's due to births, what's due to deaths, and what's due to immigration and emigration. I then focus on the idea of transfers. So looking at people who say they're one thing in 2001 and who say they're something completely different in 2011. So looking at who those people are and where they're located. So general patterns I'll try to talk to you there about. And then finally, we take a look at national identity in 2011. And we're looking there at the status of people in 2011 as to whether they said they're British, Irish, Northern Irish, or had dual, multiple and complex identities. And we're trying to look at that in terms of their situation in 2011, but what they were like, what their situation was in 2001. And then just a few words quickly in conclusion. So I've covered some of those points basically in what I said over the first couple of slides there. But just to sort of talk a little bit, religious affiliation is important for obvious reasons here to do with the formation and partition of the state, and it's something which is key to electoral mobilisation. And of course it's very important too in terms of equality policy as well, in terms of monitoring, in terms of understanding the composition and makeup of workforces and other things as well. So I know that Mike Nesbitt, I heard him say there that people are forced to declare themselves when they enter the assembly. So it's obviously very important. So overall population numbers are important, as is geographical distribution and segregation. So it's not just the numbers, it's where people live as well that's also important. And the new questions on national identity in the 2011 census have also attracted attention as well. So I'm not going to sort of labour the point there too much about people with British and Irish identities. We're largely going to focus on people who've got dual, multiple identities. So there's an option where you could sort of say you're British and Northern Irish, or Irish and Northern Irish, or even in some rare cases, Northern Irish, Irish and British as well. So people in that sort of category, and then on the Northern Irish, pure and simple. So, despite this sort of interest, there's actually been few or no studies at the population level of these sorts of issues. And that's largely because you've had different censuses, 1991, 1981, 2001 and 2011, and you've got time slices, you've got cross-sections of the population. But for the first time, there's been a possibility of linking census data through time, which means you can actually get a grasp on some of these issues and their dynamics and some of the processes of change. But let's talk very briefly about the data so you see where we are and where we're coming from. So the Northern Ireland longitudinal study, it's about 28% sample of the population, based on 104 out of 365 birth dates. It's taken from health cards, and the health card information is linked to the census. And it's been linked actually to the 2011 census, the 2001 census, and just in the past few weeks, it's been linked back to 1991 and 1981 as well. So it's actually possible to trace groups of people and see how they've changed through time at different censuses. So that's a new thing that we can do for the population. So in the first part of the presentation, where we're looking at the components of change, we're dealing with all NILS members who had a census record in 2011 or in 2001. And you can see the numbers there. So about 450,000 people, say. So it's quite a large number. So we can actually do quite a lot with the data. For the second part of the presentation, looking at changing religious affiliation and national identity, we cut things down. So we're looking at people who are adult, aged over 18 in 2001, who you can assume may make their own choice about what they state as their religion, and people who are also here in 2011 as well. So if you're looking at transitions and seeing whether people have changed from being Catholic to non, or Protestant to non over that 10-year period, they've obviously got to be there at both time periods. And if they're not there at both time periods, you're not going to be able to do the work. So we focus then just on people who got census records in both 2011 and 2001. So, demographic accounts. And really, these are just giving you a rough idea of the factors which have underlain the changes in the structure of the population. Basically, there's been a slight increase. This is based on the people, on the question of whether people say they've got a religion or not, what they say. So it's not the religion you've been brought up in, it's based on the religion that people say they actually have. And you can see there's been a fall there in the proportion of Protestants over that 10-year period, a marginal increase in the proportion of Catholics, and a growth in the share of nons and not stateds. And there's been a growth in the share of nons and not stateds. It goes back a long way. It's been a gradually increasing share of the Northern Ireland population. It's not as high, that share, as it is in Britain. So in Scotland, the equivalent figure would be something like 35, 37%. So it's nearly a third of the population there, which is it's got no religion or doesn't state a religion. So what did I do to try to work out the components of change? Well, I had the population starting in 2001, and I added, and I looked at that, and I looked at the effects of the transfers of people between the three different groups. So Protestants who said in 2001 they were Protestant and non in 2011, people who said they were non in 2001 and Protestant or Catholic in 2011. So I looked at the transfer between the groups. I took away people who died over the 10-year period. I added in births, so people who are aged less than 10 in the census in the NILS in 2011. I took away immigrants, and I added in immigrants and people who'd lived in Northern Ireland and left and then come back again. And I tried to remove double counting. So some of the population aged under 10 who I was counting as births might have been people who had been immigrated into Northern Ireland or had been re-entrants, and I took them out. And this is what I got. Right, so the red is natural increase. It's the excess of births over deaths. The green is net migration. And the blue is net transfers. So that's the effect of change in terms of transfers between the three blocks of being Catholic, Protestant and other, and nons and not stateds. So, about 9% of people who said they were Protestant in 2001 said they were non or not stated in 2011. About 6% of Catholics who said they were non or not stated in 2001 said they were, about 6% of Catholics in 2001 said they were non or not stated in 2011. So there's a slight difference between the groups. But the key thing to note is natural increase. The population which is Catholic and which has no religion tends on average to be younger than the people who declare themselves to be Protestant. The differential in birth rates has decreased, but because of the younger age structure, There's simply more Catholic children being born and more older Protestants who are dying. So it's to do with demographic momentum and the existing structure of the community. There's been a buoying of net migration into Northern Ireland, and some of that number for the Catholic side of the equation there is probably at least in part down to immigration from overseas, from Poles, Portuguese and other people from Catholic countries who have probably declared themselves to be Catholic. The interesting thing about the net transfers is this, is that more Protestants transfer out of Protestantism to become nuns or not stateds. We suspect that there's actually sort of more of a churn and transfer back into Protestantism from the nuns. Whereas if you're Catholic and you tend to move out, you probably tend to stay out. And they're actually just a little bit different there. So that's why there's actually a higher net loss for Catholics than there is for the Protestant denominations. Because more people who said they were non in 2001 said they were Protestant in 2011. So different dynamics to do with religious switching, different numbers in terms of births and deaths are the factors which have underlain the absolute number changes through time and have also driven the changes in proportions. And those are just some of the general patterns. Now, I mean, it's difficult to be precise about the precise numbers, to be exact down to the nearest 10 people or 100 people or even 1,000 people. But what it is giving you is an overall shape and an overall structure of the important things which are driving population shifts in Northern Ireland. And it's down to differential age structures and therefore the differential effects of births and deaths. That's the main thing. Migration and transfers are relatively small. So, headline results, quickly moving on to the transfers. There are considerable transfers between the Protestant denominations. So people can say they're Protestant in 2001, Church of Ireland in 2011. People are shifting and moving about there. There are very few transfers from Catholics to Protestants and vice versa. Protestants are more likely to become nuns than Catholics, but nuns are more likely to change their affiliation back, to a Protestant denomination afterwards. There are similarities in the switching behaviour of Catholics and Protestants. So we found, for example, that as you get older, you're less likely to declare yourself to be non, basically. People who lived in social rented housing were more likely in 2001 to move towards being a non. People who weren't married in 2001 were more likely to, in the end, to state they were non in 2011. But there are differences by denomination. So the more educated you are as a Protestant, the more likely you are to say that you're non in 2011. Whereas for Catholics, there doesn't seem to be an education effect like that. But what is important is the fact that you were divorced in 2001. So marital status seems to have a much more powerful role for Catholics than it does for Protestants. And something else which also comes out later is that people who change address, people who move, also tend to shift religious identities or religious affiliations through time. So there's something about moving spatially. There's something about changing address. This is just interesting, and we're trying to work out what this meant actually, and what could be underlying this before the presentation. But the red areas have got areas of high switching from Catholic to non and Protestant to non. And looking at the position there for Northern Ireland, you can see there's roughly some sort of east-west pattern for both broad groups of denomination. So there's something about the east, there's something about North Down, and this sort of area, where people are more likely to make that transfer out over the time period and to become non. Of course, many of the Protestants over that time period may well have moved back in and come back into a religion from the non-status. And the important point to note is we think we capture numbers exactly in the census, but actually the population in terms of religious affiliation and other aspects of identity is in a constant state of flux. So here's some stuff quickly on national identity, and I'll move on pretty sharpish. But this is just breaking down national identities by religious background. And if you look at the dual identities, they're it's the dark blue. I'll try and shoot this. Yeah. It's that one there. And the Irish, and the Northern Irish. You can see that the non-stateds, quite a few of those look like the Northern Irish. Quite a few Catholics. Not so many Presbyterians, Church of Ireland, Methodists, others. So it is, as was highlighted earlier, a bit of a bimodal distribution. Not strongly, but a little bit, isn't it? Look at the dual identities. Quite a small part of the population. Not many Catholics, but far more Protestants who may have ticked more than one box on the national identity question in 2011. So there are some differences there. And of course, there are some which are absolutely stark, staring obvious. So, I mean, if you just look at the proportion of people who say they're British by denomination, it's just what you'd expect to see. And look at it for Catholics. So it suggests at least we've got some faith in our data, and it's probably showing the right sorts of things. And here's some maps which I won't sort of hang about over too long, but this is sort of pretty obvious. So the percent Irish per super output area. The sorts of areas you might expect: West Belfast, South Armagh, areas in the northeast, for example, Moyle, in the Glens of Antrim, where there's a Catholic majority. Quite a few people there who say they're Irish, which is what you'd expect. The British map is nearly a mirror opposite of that, and it's basically a map of Protestantism, so that's not too remarkable either. This is a little bit more interesting, I think. So people with dual or multiple identities, a little bit more evenly spread. But if we look at actually where people cluster and where they're located, there's actually quite a few people here and here who fall into that category. So in the east of Northern Ireland. And the percent Northern Irish, well, that looks sort of quite an even spread, which probably matches to some extent the complex nature and distribution of people that was mentioned in the first presentation. But if we play about with the data a little bit, we see that the Northern Irish are particularly clustered in rural areas, in the south here, and in the west, but not so much around this part of Northern Ireland. So there's particularly high clusters of this identity sort of round here. So interesting, so something to do with rurality perhaps, maybe to do with identities in rural areas, not sure, but something going on. Right, so some quick headline figures, because I know my time's very nearly up, so I don't want to bore you to tears. People with dual stroke multiple identities, the headline figures: more likely to be Protestant, more likely to be retired, more likely switchers of religious identities, are more likely to be educated. And this is compared to people who say they're Irish, right? So all this stuff's compared to people who say they're Irish. Northern Irish, Protestants are more likely to tick this box. They're less likely to be deprived, which matches the findings from the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. They're also more likely to be highly educated than the Irish, and also more so than the British. In fact, the British population tends to have the lowest levels of education, and particularly, I think, in terms of the Church of Ireland population. So particular problems there. British, more likely to be Protestant than the Northern Irish, which is staring obvious. And they're also more likely to switch between different religious identities and to be less educated. And people who said they got no identity at all, more likely to be deprived, more likely to have moved, and to have moved into Catholic areas. And they're more likely to be Protestants than Catholics. So these are overall summaries of the population and the overall patterns. But there could be things lurking within the details of the data which we need to explore a little bit more. Just to say, there are sort of contextual and geographical effects. So those living in deprived areas are more likely to say they're Irish, which is interesting. And there's evidence that living in areas which are sort of strongly Catholic or Protestant tends to sort of concentrate, tends to strengthen identities in some places, in some cases. So residents, so people living in highly concentrated areas and belonging to a minority in that area are more likely to say they're one of the two main groups, British or Irish, rather than Northern Irish or complex, these dual identities. And this effect is not just typical for Northern Ireland alone, but it's known from the wider literature. So it's a sort of thing you expect to see. So the main identities are stronger in more polarised areas. Conclusion. Dual and mixed identity people more educated and are more likely to change between the religious and not stated, and possibly back again. The Northern Irish are indeed a diverse group, and that was highlighted in the first presentation. They seem to sit between the Irish and British in terms of these statistics, in terms of education and in terms of religious affiliation. So we need to drill maybe into the data more to get hold of that. Changing address seems to be important for some changes of religious identity, changes in identity, and also for national identities. Less so for Catholics and the Irish, who seem to be less mobile. We can only think it could be to do with the life stage, where people leave the parental home and they're free to declare they've got no religion or a different religion. Or where people perhaps move communities. I don't mean community in the sense of nationalist or unionist, but just move to a different area where maybe they can feel they can maybe be themselves. But there seems to be some effect of changing address. So, we don't claim causation, we're looking at patterns and association. But there are some interrelationships within the data, and I think there's probably room there for further inquiry and perhaps to drill further into the census data and into the nils. Thanks very much. There's the disclaimer which I've got to show, and I'm sorry for running 5 minutes over. Thank you.